I worked as a land surveyor for about 6 years, mostly doing contract jobs in remote areas. The kind of work where you're dropped into a section of forest with coordinates, a handheld GPS, and a schedule, and you just map, measure, and move on. It's quiet work, repetitive, and usually nothing ever happens. That's part of why I liked it. This job was in northern Idaho, near a stretch of forest that hadn't been touched in a long time. It wasn't a national park, more like managed land that no one really visited. Our job was to mark out property boundaries for a future logging assessment. Standard stuff. There were 2 of us on the assignment, me and a guy named Travis. He had been doing this longer than I had, probably in his early 40s, and he treated everything like it was routine, even when it wasn't. We set up a small base camp about 2 miles in from the nearest service road. Nothing fancy, just 2 tents, equipment, and enough food for a week. The first day went exactly how you'd expect. We hiked out along the coordinates, placed markers at specific intervals, logged everything, and came back before dark. The markers we used were bright orange stakes with reflective tape, easy to spot even in low light. On the second day, we followed the same route to continue the line we had started. That's when Travis stopped walking. One of the markers we had placed a day before was gone. At first, I thought we had just missed it. It happens sometimes if you're slightly off your line. But Travis checked his GPS, walked a few feet in either direction, and then stopped again. He said, "No, this is right." We looked around for a while, and then we found the marker about 20 yards off from where it should have been. It was still upright, but it had clearly been pulled out and pushed back into the ground somewhere else. We didn't say much about it. The obvious explanation was an animal. Maybe a deer or something larger had knocked it loose. It didn't feel like a big deal at the time. We reset it and kept working. By the end of the day, we had placed about 12 more markers in a straight line through the trees. Everything seemed normal after that, but on the 3rd morning, things changed. We headed back out along the same line, and within the first 10 minutes, we saw that multiple markers had been moved. Not knocked over, not broken, moved. Each one was placed just a little off from where it originally was, almost like someone had picked them up and set them down again with intention. Some were only a few feet off. Others were further. Travis didn't like that. He crouched down near one of the markers and looked at the ground around it. The soil was disturbed, but not in a way that made sense for an animal. There were no clear tracks, no hoof marks, no paw prints, just loose dirt. He stood up and said, "Someone's messing with these." That didn't sit right with me. We were far enough out that it would have been unusual to run into anyone, let alone someone walking around moving survey markers in the middle of nowhere. Still, we adjusted them again and continued the job. Neither of us wanted to overthink it. That night at camp, Travis brought it up again. He said if someone was out there, we'd probably run into them eventually. He didn't sound worried, just annoyed. I asked him if it could be another survey crew. He shook his head. They wouldn't touch our line. That's not how it works. We didn't talk about it after that. On the 4th day, we split up. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes it's faster to cover more ground if you work parallel lines. We stayed within radio range, and the plan was to meet back at a specific marker around midday. I remember that morning clearly because everything felt normal again. No moved markers, no signs of anything being off. It actually made me feel a little stupid for being concerned. I worked my section for a few hours, placing markers, logging coordinates, just focusing on the routine. Around noon, I headed toward the meeting point. Travis wasn't there. That wasn't immediately alarming. He could have been running late or working a little further down his line. I radioed him. No response. I tried again. Nothing. At that point, I started to feel it. Not panic, just a shift in how everything felt around me. The The forest was quiet in a way I hadn't noticed before. I decided to walk along his line to meet him halfway. That's when I saw what happened to the markers. They were no longer just slightly moved. They had been rearranged. Instead of a straight line, they curved. Not randomly, but in a way that pulled off deeper into the woods, away from both our assigned paths. It looked deliberate, like a trail. I stood there for a while, just looking at it, trying to make sense of it. Travis wouldn't do something like that. Not as a joke, not as a mistake. I radioed him again. Still nothing. At that point, I made a decision I regret. I followed the markers. At first, I thought maybe Travis had noticed something and adjusted the line for a reason. That was the only explanation that made any kind of sense to me in that moment. The further I walked, the less sense it made. The markers were placed too close together now. Some were only a few feet apart, almost like whoever was placing them wanted to make sure the path was obvious, and they kept going deeper. After about 20 minutes of walking, I realized something else. The forest around me didn't match the map anymore. Not in any obvious way at first, but enough that I noticed. The terrain felt wrong. The slope of the ground, the spacing of the trees. It didn't line up with what I had been seeing on the GPS. I checked my device. The signal was still there, but it was drifting. The coordinates weren't stable. That's when I stopped. I remember thinking, this isn't right. I turned around to head back, and I couldn't see the path I had just walked. The markers behind me were gone. Not all of them, but enough that the direction I came from wasn't clear anymore. It felt like I had stepped into a place that was shifting just enough to throw me off. I stayed calm, at least at first. I tried to retrace my steps based on memory, but every direction started to look the same after a few minutes. The trees were dense, and there were no clear landmarks. I radioed Travis again. Nothing. I radioed base. Static. That's when I heard something. It wasn't loud. It sounded like movement somewhere off to my left. Not fast, not aggressive. Just something moving through the trees. I called out, "Travis." No response. The movement stopped. Then, after a few seconds, I heard it again. A little closer this time. I don't know why, but I didn't go toward it. I started walking in the opposite direction, trying to put distance between me and whatever it was. After a while, I saw another marker. It was one of ours, placed straight ahead of me. I approached it slowly, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were marks on it. Not scratches exactly, but lines pressed into the surface of the stake. They weren't random. They looked like someone had dragged something sharp along it, over and over. I looked around. There were more markers further ahead, all in a line, again leading deeper. I didn't follow them this time. I turned and kept walking in what I hoped was the direction of camp. It took me hours to find my way back. By the time I reached camp, it was already getting dark. Travis wasn't there. His tent was untouched. His gear was still inside. Nothing looked disturbed. It was like he had just stepped out and never came back. I stayed up most of the night, waiting, listening, hoping I'd hear him come back. He never did. The next morning, I hiked out to the road and contacted our supervisor. Search teams came in later that day. They didn't find Travis. They didn't find the rearranged markers either. In fact, they told me something that still doesn't sit right with me. According to their sweep, all of our markers were exactly where they were supposed to be, in a straight line, undisturbed. I tried to explain what I had seen, what had happened, but the more I talked, the less it sounded believable. They wrote it off as disorientation, stress. Maybe I got turned around and misremembered things, but I know what I saw. I know those markers were moved, and I know I followed them somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. I left that job not long after. Never went back into deep survey work again. The part that bothers me the most isn't that Travis disappeared. It's that something out there understood exactly what those markers meant, and it used them. Incidents like this get explained as navigation errors, environmental disorientation, or even early-stage panic affecting memory. In dense forests, especially in uneven terrain, it's possible for people to misjudge direction and distance. GPS drift can also happen under heavy canopy. But what doesn't get explained is intentional pattern change. Survey markers being repositioned in a meaningful way suggests human interference, yet no evidence of another person was ever found in the area. Cases like this often end unresolved. Missing persons in remote forests are not uncommon, and without clear signs of struggle or direction, searches can fail quickly. Whatever happened to Travis was officially classified as a disappearance during field work, but I've never believed it was that simple. I took the temporary ranger job in late September, just before the season started winding down. It wasn't a permanent position, just a short-term assignment to cover a section of forest in western Montana, while the regular ranger was on medical leave. I had done similar work before, so nothing about it felt unusual at the time. The area I was assigned to wasn't popular with hikers. It sat a few miles off the main trails, mostly used for old service access and occasional wildlife monitoring. There was one active ranger cabin where I stayed, and then there were a few older structures scattered deeper in the forest. Most of them were marked as decommissioned. One of those places was listed in my paperwork as Station 14. It showed up on the map as a small ranger station built sometime in the 1960s, officially shut down in the early 2000s. The note next to it said, "Secured. No access required." That should have been the end of it, but on my third day, I got a routine checklist from the district office. It included basic tasks like checking trail conditions, clearing debris, and confirming the status of old structures. Station 14 was on that list. I remember calling in to confirm it. I told them, "This one says no access required. You still want me to check it?" The person on the radio paused for a second, then said, "Just verify it's still secured. That's it." So that's what I planned to do. It took me most of the morning to reach it. The trail leading out there was barely maintained, more like an old path that hadn't been used in years. Trees had grown close together, and parts of the trail were blocked by fallen branches. By the time I got there, it was already past noon. The station itself was smaller than I expected. Just a single-story wooden structure with a front porch and 2 windows. The paint was faded, and the roof looked like it hadn't been repaired in a long time. The first thing I checked was the door. It was locked, just like the report said. There was a heavy chain wrapped through the handle and a padlock securing it in place. The lock didn't look new, but it wasn't rusted shut either. It seemed intact. I walked around the building to check the windows. Both of them were covered from the inside, not boarded up, but blocked with something that kept the interior completely dark. I couldn't see anything through them. That part felt normal enough. What didn't feel normal was the ground around the station. There were signs of disturbance, not obvious footprints, but the dirt near the porch looked recently shifted, like it had been walked over more than once. The grass around the edges was pressed down in a few spots. I stood there for a minute, trying to make sense of it. It could have been animals. That was the easiest explanation. Still, I took a few photos and noted it down. I wasn't there to investigate anything, just to confirm the structure was secured. Before I left, I knocked on the door. I don't know why I did it. It was just instinct. There was no response. I waited a few seconds, then knocked again. Nothing. So I turned around and headed back. That should have been it. But that night, back at my cabin, I started thinking about it again. Not the station itself, but the way the ground looked around it, it didn't sit right with me. I had seen enough animal tracks to know the difference between random movement and repeated activity. The next morning, I called it in. I told them, Station 14 is locked, but there's signs something's been moving around it recently. There was another pause on the line. Then they said, noted. No further action needed. That was it. No follow-up questions. No instructions to check again. Nothing. I let it go. For a couple of days, everything went back to normal. I stayed busy with trail checks and minor maintenance work. The weather started getting colder, and there were fewer signs of wildlife. Then, on the 6th night, I heard something. It was late. I was inside the cabin, writing up my daily report. The generator was off, so it was quiet except for the wind outside. At first, I thought it was just that, wind moving through the trees. But then I heard it again, a faint rhythmic sound, like something hitting wood. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady. I sat there for a minute, listening. The sound stopped. Then it started again, a little more clearly this time. It took me a few seconds to realize what it reminded me of. Knocking. I stepped outside. The air was cold, and the forest was completely still. I stood on the porch, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. There was nothing. No movement. No sound. After a while, I went back inside. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked the area around my cabin. There were no tracks, no signs that anyone had been nearby. I told myself it was just something loose hitting the structure, maybe a branch or part of the cabin shifting with the temperature. That explanation held for about a day. Then I went back to Station 14. I didn't have a real reason to go. It wasn't on my schedule, but I kept thinking about it. The walk out there felt longer than before. I don't know if it actually was, or if I was just more aware of everything around me. When I reached the station, the first thing I did was check the door again. The chain was still there. The padlock was still secured. Nothing had changed. Then I noticed the window. One of the coverings inside had shifted. It wasn't fully open, but there was a small gap now, just enough to see a thin line of darkness beyond it. I moved closer. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, but I could see a little bit of the interior, just a small section of the room. There was a table, and something on top of it. At first, I thought it was just debris. Then I realized it was arranged, not randomly placed, organized. I stepped back. That didn't make sense. If the station was sealed and no one had access to it, nothing inside should have changed. I walked around the building again, slower this time. That's when I saw it. Near the back wall, there was a small gap in the structure. Not a door, not a window, just a section where the wood didn't sit flush anymore. It wasn't big enough for a person to walk through easily, but it was enough that someone could have forced their way in if they really wanted to. I stood there, looking at it, tried to decide what to do. I didn't go inside. That's something I've thought about a lot since then. I could have checked. I could have confirmed what was in there. But something about it felt wrong. Instead, I went back to the cabin and reported it. This time, the response was different. They told me to stay away from the station. No explanation. No follow-up. Just, do not return to that location. That should have been enough. But that night, the knocking came back. Louder this time. Clear enough that I could tell it wasn't coming from my cabin. It was distant. And it was steady. I knew where it was coming from. Station 14. I didn't go out there. I stayed inside, listening to it for a while. Then eventually it stopped. The next morning, I packed up my gear. I didn't wait for instructions. I drove out and handed in my report in person. When I brought up Station 14, the person I spoke to didn't look surprised. They just said, that structure is sealed. No one is inside. I told them what I saw. The window, the movement, the sounds. They wrote it down. but I could tell they weren't going to act on it. Before I left, I asked one more question. I said, "When was the last time anyone actually went inside that station?" They didn't answer right away. Then they said, "It hasn't been in use for over 20 years. I didn't push it further. A few weeks later, I heard through someone I used to work with that Station 14 had been removed from all active maps. No official reason, just gone from the system. Abandoned structures in remote forests sometimes attract unauthorized occupants. It's possible someone found a way inside Station 14 through structural damage and was living there undetected. Limited patrol frequency and poor visibility could allow that to go unnoticed for long periods. However, the exterior lock remaining intact complicates that explanation. It suggests either entry through an unusual access point or that the structure's secured status was inaccurate. Reports of sounds like knocking can often be explained by temperature changes, causing wood to expand and contract, or loose materials shifting in the wind. In isolated environments, those sounds can feel more deliberate than they actually are. Still, the combination of physical signs, interior changes, and the lack of follow-up raises questions that were never officially addressed. This happened in 2017, in Oregon, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip. It was me and my friend Daniel. We had done trips like this before, nothing extreme, just backcountry hiking with a couple nights of camping. We picked a forest area that wasn't too crowded, but still had marked trails. The plan was straightforward. Hiking on day 1, camp near a creek, loop around through a secondary trail on day 2, then head back out on day 3. We had both a physical map and GPS, and we stuck to marked routes. Neither of us was the type to go off trail just for the sake of it. The first day went exactly as planned. We reached our campsite by late afternoon, set up, ate, and got some rest. Nothing unusual happened. No strange sounds, no weird signs. Just a normal quiet night in the woods. On the second day, we packed up and started the loop. That's when we saw the trail. It wasn't on the map. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Trails change sometimes. People make unofficial paths, or older ones don't show up on updated maps. This one looked used. The ground was slightly worn, and there were signs that people or animals had been through it more than once. Daniel was the one who suggested taking it. He said it might cut time off the loop. It was heading in roughly the right direction, and if it connected back to the main trail, we'd save a couple of hours. I wasn't completely convinced, but it didn't look dangerous. So we took it. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt normal. The trail was narrow but clear enough to follow. The trees were dense, but that wasn't unusual for the area. Then I started noticing small things. The trail didn't feel consistent. Parts of it looked worn, but other parts looked untouched, like it had been made recently. The ground shifted between packed dirt and loose leaves in a way that didn't match regular foot traffic. I pointed it out to Daniel. He shrugged it off. He said maybe different people use different sections. It wasn't a great explanation, but it was enough at the time. We kept going. After about 40 minutes, I checked the GPS. That's when I noticed we weren't where we should have been. Not by a little, but by enough that it didn't make sense. The direction we were moving didn't line up with the trail we thought we were on. I told Daniel. We stopped and checked the map together. According to both the map and the GPS, there shouldn't have been any trail where we were. That was the first time we considered turning back. But when we looked behind us, the path didn't look the same anymore. It was still there, but it didn't feel as clear as it had before. The direction we came from wasn't as obvious. The trees all looked similar, and there were no distinct markers. Daniel said, We should keep going forward until we hit something recognizable. It wasn't a great plan, but standing there didn't seem like a better option, so we kept walking. The trail started narrowing. Not suddenly, just gradually. The space between the trees got tighter, and the ground became uneven. It felt less like a trail and more like something that had been pushed through the forest without much care. Then we found something that made us stop. There was a piece of cloth hanging from a branch. It looked like part of a shirt, torn and caught on the wood. It wasn't old. The fabric still had color. It hadn't faded or broken down the way it would if it had been there for a long time. Daniel took it down and looked at it. There was no blood on it, no obvious damage other than the tear. We didn't say much after that. We just kept moving. Another 20 minutes passed, maybe more. Time started to feel off. We weren't checking it as often. Then Daniel started acting different. It wasn't anything obvious at first. He just got quieter. Normally, he talked a lot during hikes. Even if it was just random observations, he filled the silence. But now he wasn't saying anything unless I asked him something directly. I asked if he was okay. He said he was fine, but his answers were short, and he didn't look at me when he said them. We kept walking. At some point, I realized the forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. That kind of silence stands out when you're used to hearing constant background noise. I mentioned it. Daniel didn't respond. He just kept walking. I stopped. He kept going for a few steps before he noticed and turned around. I told him something felt wrong, that we should stop and figure out how to get back. He looked at me for a few seconds, then said, "We're almost there." I asked, "Almost where?" He didn't answer that. He just turned and kept walking again. That's when I started to feel it. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. The sense that things weren't lining up anymore, that we were moving through a place that didn't match what we thought it was. I followed him, but I kept a little distance. Then he stopped suddenly. I nearly walked into him. He was staring straight ahead. I looked past him. There was a clearing. It wasn't large, just an open space in the middle of the trees. The ground was mostly bare, with very little vegetation. In the center, there was something on the ground. At first, I thought it was just debris. Then I realized it was a pile of items. Clothing, different pieces, scattered and layered over each other. Shirts, jackets, maybe even parts of bags. None of it looked old. It all looked like it had been left there recently. I felt something shift in my chest at that point. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a trail anymore. I told Daniel we needed to leave. He didn't respond. He took a few steps forward into the clearing. I grabbed his arm. He pulled away. Not aggressively, just enough to break contact. Then he said something that didn't make sense. He said, "This is where it ends." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at the pile. I didn't like how still he was. I told him we were going back. He didn't move. That's when I made a decision. I turned around and started walking back the way we came. I expected him to follow. He didn't. I called his name. No response. I turned back. He was still standing in the clearing. I walked a few steps toward him. That's when I heard something behind me. Movement. I turned around again. There was nothing there. But when I turned back toward the clearing, Daniel was gone. He wasn't in the center anymore. He wasn't anywhere I could see. I called his name again. Nothing. I stepped into the clearing, looking around, trying to find where he went. There were no clear paths leading out. No signs of where he could have gone in that short time. I felt panic then. Real panic. I called his name over and over. No response. I stayed there for a few minutes, maybe longer. It's hard to say. Then I heard something. A voice. It sounded like Daniel, but it was coming from the trees. Not from a direction I could pinpoint. Just from somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing. He said my name. I answered immediately. I asked where he was. The voice didn't respond right away. Then it said my name again, but it sounded off. Not wrong enough to be completely different, but not right either. The tone was flat, like it was being repeated without understanding. That's when I stopped answering. I backed out of the clearing slowly. The voice didn't follow. I turned and walked. Then I started moving faster. Then I was running. I didn't look back. I didn't follow the trail anymore. I just moved in what I hoped was a straight line. I don't know how long it took, but eventually I found a marked trail. A real one. I followed it until I reached a road. From there I got help. Search teams went out the next day. They didn't find Daniel. They didn't find the clearing either. They said the area I described didn't match any known part of the forest. They searched for 3 days. Then they scaled it back. Officially, it was listed as a missing person case. Unresolved. I went back once, months later, with a different group. We followed the same main trail. We never found that shortcut again. In unfamiliar terrain, it's possible to misinterpret unofficial trails or animal paths as legitimate routes. Disorientation can set in quickly, especially when navigation tools become unreliable under dense canopy. Behavioral changes in stressful situations are also common. Fatigue, dehydration, and anxiety can affect judgment and communication. It's possible one person becomes focused or withdrawn while the other becomes more alert. Auditory misperception can occur in quiet environments, where the brain tries to interpret faint or ambiguous sounds as recognizable voices. However, unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas do happen, and not all are resolved. Without clear evidence, these cases often rely on incomplete accounts and assumptions. In this case, no physical trace of Daniel was ever recovered, and the trail we took was never documented again.